In 1979, then U.S. President Jimmy Carter signed the Executive Order 12170, freezing $9.5 billion in assets of the Iranian government in the U.S. and beginning a trade embargo. The U.S. restricts Iran's international trade settlement by directly freezing its financial assets in the U.S. or internationally. In 2015, Iran had 120 billion worth of frozen assets in international accounts. Since 1980, Iran has been demanding the return of its frozen assets from the U.S., the European Union, and South Korea, but its demands have been largely ignored. From banning U.S. companies from trading with Iran to barring the U.S. government from purchasing from companies that do business with Iran, and imposing sanctions on foreign companies that help Iran develop oil and gas, the U.S. has been using its international hegemony to manipulate the United Nations or allies to restrict other countries from doing business with Iran. Iran's imports and exports, including oil and industrial metals, dropped sharply after the reimposition of sanctions in 2018. Iranian oil production would increase from 2.1 million barrels to 3.8 million barrels per day if the U.S. lifts its sanctions on Iran, according to Iranian oil ministry sources. While the US dollar is the basic currency for international transactions, SWIFT controls more than 80% of global cross-border payments. The US restricts financial transactions between Iran and other countries by banning the use of US dollar for settlement and prohibiting Iranian banks and institutions from participating in SWIFT. The U.S. Treasury Department has imposed sanctions on a number of Iranian banks and financial institutions to limit Iran's financial ties with the world. Iran's overall GDP has fallen from nearly 600 billion in 2012 to less than 200 billion in 2020. Since 2018, the Iranian currency, the rial, has depreciated by about 60%. It has caused a continuous rise in the cost of living for Iranians and employment difficulties. An estimated 12.4% of the population is expected to be out of work in 2021, according to IMF projections. A $5 billion emergency loan requested by Iranian government from the International Monetary Fund in response to COVID-19 is still under consideration, and the government claims that the U.S. blocked the loan request. U.S. sanctions have also limited Iran's ability to use its foreign exchange reserves to purchase pharmaceutical and medical items, according to a UN rapporteur. Unilateral sanctions imposed by the U.S. inflicted $1 trillion worth of damages on Iran's economy, said Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. The sanctions include freezing assets, banning financial transactions, sanctioning main export industries, and sanctioning individuals and entities that provide support to Venezuela. The unilateral sanctions have caused more than $110 billion in losses. The inflation increased 3,000% in 2020 and will reach 5,500% in 2021. The U.S. has been imposing a comprehensive embargo, including economical, financial, and trade embargoes against Cuba for 60 years. That includes asset freezing, exchange controls, bans on financial transactions, and sanctions against the foreign companies that have economic relations with Cuba. Cuba's foreign minister announced in 2020 that Cuba has accumulated losses of more than $147.8 billion over nearly 60 years due to the long-standing economic sanctions and the trade embargo imposed by the U.S. The sanctions imposed on North Korea by the U.S. and the UN Security Council under its control include cutting off financial assistance, interrupting economic cooperation, banning financial transactions, travel restrictions, assets freezing, and trade restrictions. The economic restrictions imposed by the U.S., such as cutting trade links, freezing the assets of Haitian military leaders in American banks, and restricting the shipping of goods, have resulted in disastrous consequences for Haiti. In the 3 years, Haiti experienced a 70% unemployment rate in industry, a 50% inflation rate, and a 30% reduction in gross national product. According to the Treasury 2021 Sanctions Review launched by the U.S. government, the number of entities on the U.S. sanctions list has increased ninefold over the past 20 years, from 912 in 2000 to 9,421 in 2021.